Right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining. So this is a session looking at the best practices for cloud security this year. Thank you very much for joining us. We've got a couple of speakers to introduce myself. First of all, I'm Neil Langridge from E92+, so we're a cybersecurity specialist. We're joined today by Raluca from Smarttech247 and David from Trend Micro, who's a senior pre-sales engineer. So thank you both for joining us.
Thank you very much, Neil. We're delighted to hold this session today.
So it's an honor for me and Trend. Thanks for inviting us along.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us. The format of it is very much going to be an open discussion. We're going to go through quite a few different topics, both in terms of looking at what the current situation is, as we say, looking at best practices, giving you some kind of practical advice and tips, and also looking at what the future trends are going to be around cloud cybersecurity. There are going to be a couple of polls that we're going to be running kind of throughout, and also the chat boxes are open. So if anybody does have any questions, then absolutely feel free to pop them in, and we'll try and cover them either throughout the sessions or in a roundup at the end. So first of all, to kick off, maybe if we can start with you, Raluca, I suppose. Sure. Obviously the current situation is very much hard to avoid. Obviously Corona has made kind of very significant differences for all organizations, but obviously especially around cybersecurity. So if you want to just kind of give us some thought in terms of how you see those changes affecting organizations.
Sure. Thank you, Neil. I think that we can all agree that COVID-19 has had a huge impact on IT networks. With so many organizations shifting to remote work arrangements, cloud computing has seen quite a significant spike in demand. Now, if you think about it, in many ways, the cloud is the perfect platform for this time of uncertainty because capacity is easy to adjust, which allows organizations to right-size their network infrastructure so that they can meet their needs. Now, keeping those networks secure, however, is a different challenge. So if I were to summarize the three key areas where we've seen a significant impact on cloud security, I would say the first one would be DDoS attacks. DDoS attacks are really easy to launch, probably even easier now, and they can have devastating effects, right? One of the first attacks of this kind that we've seen since right after the major shift to remote working was in March. It was the DDoS attack on the US Health Agency, which was part of a coordinated campaign. The second area that I'd like to mention is phishing. We've seen, at least in Smarttech, we've seen a 5,000% increase in phishing attempts since March. Now, not only that, but cyber criminals are exploiting COVID-19 and using it to launch specific campaigns that relate to the pandemic, specific phishing campaigns. The third area that I'd like to mention is something that we call cloud sprawl. So many organizations, especially larger organizations, have some kind of cloud resources that have been there for a long time and that are not necessarily documented and not governed, right? So when we all started shifting towards remote working, we needed to make use of all resources that we had. We needed to look everywhere. Where do we have any bit of infrastructure that we can use? How fast can we use it? And sometimes, well, in some cases, security maybe wasn't the first concern for so many organizations, right? So sometimes it had to come second, which kind of also relates to a little bit of shadow IT, which I think we're going to discuss in a minute. So these would be the three key areas where we've seen a major impact on cloud security. And I'm sure David has a few more examples.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a big question. How has COVID-19 affected? I mean, we've seen huge landscapes. Just to relate to what Raluca just said, we would have seen a lot of hospitals being ransomware right in the middle of the pandemic. I mean, this is scrupulous behavior. Threat actors, they don't really care. It's all about, you know, getting revenue and money and so on. But the other big changes we would have seen is the remote sort of revolution, you know, people having to be disjointed, separated from the protections of their traditional on-premise infrastructure, such as their, sorry, am I hearing something? Is there weird noises happening there? Or is that just me? But anyway, you know, they would have a lot of these requirements to have shadow IT, if you will, even shroud the same levels of security, multi-layered security, web security, gateway security. And we see a lot of them as well having to step off their VPN technologies, right? So again, this is counterintuitive to what the VPN is designed for. But during the pandemic, what you saw then was a large movement of people, if you will, moving away from the VPN because it's too busy, it's congested, they don't have enough seats to facilitate connections. My program X doesn't work because I need to join Y. You know, these are the kind of the real complexities that we're seeing a lot of customers, businesses, partners, the world over suffering with the same kind of complexities.
And I would like to echo that in regards to the ransomware example that you've given. It's very connected to the phishing attempts that we've discussed, because sometimes it's because of a click in a phishing email, or most of the time, right? So the phishing increase and the ransomware increase are directly correlated, and we've seen numerous attempts in our SOCs to launch ransomware attacks, to launch phishing attacks. So I completely agree with you.
So I think, some of those trends, obviously, organizations were already aware of, and already kind of had possibly some policies and some solutions in place. But I suppose it's the spike, it's the rapid increase. It's the, as you said, the 5,000% increase has been a challenge. David, you mentioned kind of quite a lot of organizations had already had things like VPNs in place and were able to support that working from home environment. But how many organizations were probably were prepared necessarily for that massive increase in uplift in scale, and had and had solutions in place to be able to deal with that scale?
Well, I guess like the MSP businesses were sort of those ones that sell, shadow IT services and things like that. They probably were in a position, if they had the correct tool set and the correct, delivery in terms of non-disruption and fast automation and very powerful security layers. Those guys, I guess, MSP wise, would have been in a comfortable situation because they can just click buttons and scale out their solutions. But for standard enterprises, for small to medium businesses, for the type of customer that didn't have that type of, we'll say, IT job experience, sector expertise, security knowledge, it's a very costly thing for them to do. So more often than not, they don't have it and weren't prepared for it. So we would see during the last, we'll say, 4 months, a lot of customers scrambling for the remote capability services, SaaS position, console technology, with being able to reach all of their employee bases, no matter where they are, hotels, airports, at home, in the shed, like me, whatever the case may be.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously a lot of those infrastructure changes in deploying new solutions or new applications or new infrastructure would have been down to the IT teams, who obviously would have been under huge pressure, but that's kind of their job. Reluka, you mentioned obviously that huge increase in phishing, and we often talk about employees being the first line of defense around cybersecurity. And phishing's a perfect example of where it's not always the IT teams that see it first. It's the employees who see it because that email pops up in their inbox, and they have that decision of, are they going to click or they're not going to click on it, and how much they necessarily think about it. So, how much have you seen around organizations actually preparing and retraining their staff to be able to work in quite a different environment, be detached from the office, not being able to kind of talk to their colleagues, and being able to be that front line in a way that I think many employees have never been before?
Yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing it enough. I'm not seeing enough organizations retraining their employees in light of everything that's happening. Training, believe it or not, is for a lot of organizations is still a low priorities, which is concerning to a certain degree. And what's even more concerning is that for many of them, it's a box ticking exercise, right? Which means for them, it's enough. They send a few slides once every 6 months, once a year. Here's a little bit of awareness. Here's how you spot an email.
Yeah.
You need to look for the URL. You need to look for the salutation. You need to look for the signature. And that's it. They've done it. Now,
Yeah.
of course, there are more mature companies who understand that it has changed, especially with COVID-19, and they've retrained employees, and they've invested in tools. But for many organizations, it still seems to be a low priority. I don't know what the reason for that is. Sometimes it's cost as well.
Yeah.
It costs to invest in the tools, and it doesn't necessarily bring a straight return on investment. So it's very hard for some organizations to calculate that ROI. But what triggers me is that small companies think that they're not a target and think, once a year is enough for them. But if you're a small company, and especially if you're in the supply chain of a bigger company, now we can potentially talk about targeted attacks. And that's a different ballgame, right? We've seen so many small companies in Ireland, in the UK, in the US that have been targeted by sophisticated attacks because they wanted to reach a different target. Well, then they may be targeted with a vendor email compromise, or like an invoice redirecting scheme. And that's when it gets really complicated, because it's not really a question of spotting the URL or spotting the signature in phishing attempts when it's targeted. So I would say that not enough companies have retrained their employees since COVID-19 began, especially when you look at how many, or the increase in attacks since COVID-19 started, ramping up. What I would say, like, just to kind of give some tips for the audience, is that I know it's difficult to calculate the return on investment, but it's still an investment that you need to do. And there's so many great tools out there where, you pay online and everyone is trained online. You don't have to rely on some slides being sent from IT every year or every 6 months. There's really great tools with great content. And the nice thing about that content is that a lot of these companies have readjusted the content to include some training sessions that specifically relates to the pandemic right now.
Yeah.
The other thing that I would say that is important is try to run phishing simulations, because it's not enough just to train the employees and give them, a quick 2-minute video on this is how you spot an attack.
Yeah.
But you need to test that knowledge as well.
Yeah. And I think one of the things, kind of from our experience as well, that we're seeing is also trying to make sure you have a culture of openness. Because I think it's always very bad. It's kind of always, if people get that email and they think, oh, I don't know, and then they maybe found out later that they clicked on the wrong thing, even doing a phishing test, and they think that reflects very badly on them. And I think everybody needs to be open. But if you see something, or if you click on something wrong, then it's okay. That's fine. And if you share your knowledge or share your experience and talk to your coworkers, then everybody learns more. And I think that's really, that's hard for every organization, because nobody wants to feel like they were the one who clicked on, they clicked on the link and they shouldn't have done that. But I think kind of encouraging that culture, I think, is really important, and that transcends any technology. That's just about best practice.
I totally agree with you. It's see something, say something, like they would say in the US.
Absolutely. Just to note that we have got the poll up and quite a few people are answering, and it's interesting. It's quite mixed. There obviously are some organisations, some of you out there who have updated your training, which is fantastic to see. But there's a few that I think kind of haven't quite done that, and I think that shows that it's not necessarily been high on organisations' kind of priority list, but it is something that people do need to look at. So just kind of expanding on from that, kind of users being the front line. The other thing kind of we were talking about was organizations having to scale out quickly, and David, you mentioned kind of scrambling around trying to pull out new elements of cloud applications or new infrastructure. One thing that we have seen is, especially with business being a challenge for many people and therefore budgets tight, a need to repurpose older technology or older devices, maybe dig an old laptop out of the cupboard that was running Windows 7 simply because you needed to get your staff mobile and do that quickly. What kind of impact does that have on organizations' kind of cybersecurity posture right now?
Well, the first one would be, you're giving out old legacy tech and it only supports old legacy OS, and the vendor for the OS no longer makes the patches, no longer takes care of updating the OS.
Yeah.
So we've had a lot of situations then where you'd see organizations, and that's just to address what you've just said in relation to COVID. But there are other reasons then for it, which I think we'll get into later. But, the users that are roaming around the place and they're running around with vulnerable operating system, vulnerable Adobe, Flash, Java, plugins for their browser. You've seen all the horror stories. But this is a massive risk, because those are essentially low-hanging fruit for any novice script kiddie, any hacker, anybody who's just doing, blind probing and scanning of IPs on the internet, sitting at home in an exposed router, working remotely or even from your office. So, I mean, I could go on for hours and hours. That is a huge risk for me when I see that. But tool sets for best practices that you could do would be, things like obviously having a very tight update regimen running within your infrastructure, but also other things like virtual patching technologies and IDS technologies that are able to see exploitation attempts against unpatched vulnerabilities, and systems also that offer virtual patching over the situation when the patches aren't there or the vendor is not making the patch anymore. Like what you described, going back to the Windows 7 machine. Oops, we pulled it out of a cupboard. We're stuck. We need to deploy it. That's what the game is about.
Yeah, and also, it's, to be fair, there are going to be organisations who simply are running legacy systems, that might be related to older technology. And we've seen that in the NHS, where they might be connected to medical equipment that simply just can't be updated. So organisations, again, that culture of, it's not always important to always be on the latest system if you need to keep things up and running, but it's finding alternative ways to still protect your system where updating to newer operating systems just isn't possible.
I mean, there is the cost side of it, but then there's the technological side of it as well, where I've seen, 20, well, I'll give away my age here, 19, when I was out doing field engineering for MSPs around Ireland. I'll be honest with you, 99% of every industry type, sector type that I crossed the door of, I would have seen exactly this scenario: the conveyor belt system, because blah blah blah. It has to be. We don't have engineer. The robotics control system for the production line, the pneumatic pumps, the PLCs, the smart cities, the aerial that sits in the Jack Lynch tunnel, for example. You can be sure you've got a lot of old operating systems sitting there that need that type of extra protection around them.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think just kind of summarizing the kind of covering that topic of the current situation today. There's obviously been a huge number of changes that organisations have to embrace. But I think if you look at it from a positive perspective, a lot of people are talking about the fact that normally, if we kind of summarize things in digital transformation in terms of organisations kind of moving to the cloud and enabling kind of workers to work remotely and use cloud applications. A lot of these activities, a lot of these projects that normally might take a couple of years have happened in a couple of weeks. So both of you, are there any kind of examples where people can take best practice, they can take best ideas from what they've had to do in this short period of time, and how can some of those lessons be applied to future projects in terms of maybe not doing it at quite such panic stations, but actually, this is an example of how you very, very quickly migrate to new platforms, kind of safely and securely.
Well, I have one idea, and it's all about business continuity and disaster recovery plans. I mean, I think if everyone had their homework done with disaster recovery plans, business continuity, what do we do in case of emergencies, it wouldn't have been so painful for some organizations, right? Because when you have a plan in place, you test it once a year, let's say, and then you're primed to act in an emergency situation. And if you think about it, for a lot of organizations, this was an emergency situation because, for example, in Ireland, when we had to go into lockdown, we had 3 days to prepare for everything, right? So if you had a plan in place, if you've already tested it so many times, it should have been no problem. Whereas for some organizations, they had no idea how to do it. So I think one of the key lessons learned that I'd like to mention and really stress is the disaster recovery.
And Dave, is there anything else that you think that organizations
yes, absolutely. Disaster recovery, BCP, all the rest of that. But I'm going to come at it from the trend micro, technological side, having very, very powerful security controls. Things like the anti-reconnaissance that you'll get from our deep security and Smarttech and E92. You would be familiar with all of that. But the ability to, I'll ask a question, when any hack, when any exploit, when any detection or something comes towards your cloud-based services, the first thing that they're going to be able to get a hold of is your IP address, because your IP address will respond to a ping. Your IP address can be probed and sniffed and all kinds of things done to identify vulnerabilities that might exist and all of that. But what we're putting down, we're taking more of a technological approach towards it, so that from day one, we have a system over the endpoint that says, don't respond to IP requests, pings, report to us the IP address of who was scanning you, who and what exploit they may have tried pushed, and simply don't talk to that IP address again for 30 minutes. So the people in the script kiddies are running these scans and finding your business applications and servers in the cloud. If you've got a system that simply just says no and doesn't respond to those types of queries, I would argue, do you even, show up? Do they even look at you? Do they get do you get their attention? That's the way I would kind of, I'm always going to come at it with technological approach,
But to take it from an alternative, we always talk when we're young, be careful when talking to strangers, and that should apply to our endpoints in terms of random probes from the internet as well. But exactly. I think also just to tie on, kind of pull back to the point we mentioned earlier about organizations think, well, I'm not going to be a target. I'm a small business, I run a small manufacturing company, or I'm in hospitality, I'm doing food service. How am I going to be a target? I think the example you mentioned earlier in terms of kind of random probes, people out there searching for vulnerability, sometimes you're not the target. You just happen to end up being the target.
Exactly.
You never on a whiteboard list in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. And they run a script later on that night targeting everyone on that list. It's that simple.
Okay.
Exactly.
Smashing, thank you. So moving on to the kind of topic of actually kind of looking at those fundamentals that many organizations are moving from on-premise to cloud. So kind of potentially the old network, as we always thought, with a perimeter in the office, with a ring around it and a single gateway firewall that kind of protected us. And now that perimeter is absolutely everywhere. In that movement to the cloud, are organizations now more vulnerable? Are they more exposed than they used to be compared to that kind of more contained on-premise network?
Well, I guess nowadays, if they are electing to use a lot of the latest technologies provided by vendors, namely Trend Micro, but if they are doing things like that, and they're well architecting their framework and they're taking all of the kind of best practices they can around those aspects, then you kind of can't really argue that they're not doing what's required. But there is a hell of a lot more to just putting the endpoints in there, putting the tick box, check layers of security. There's also conformity, and there's industry compliance, and there's, whatever type of certification you might be rooting for, ISO 27001. There is just a stack of stuff on top of that. So it's important that the customers and anybody knows that they get a true representation of what those requirements are, so that they're doing the best possible job that they can within those public cloud tiers. Also, let's say if you've got public cloud, you're talking about endpoint user VDI, spinning stuff in there, or if you're just talking about spinning server infrastructure, it's the exact same. Those same requirements, those same industry certification standards are going to apply down the line, if not at some stage.
Yeah. Just to mention as well, we're running a poll, kind of asking whether everybody attending, if you can give your views on how concerned you're around security in public cloud environments compared to on-premise. Raluca, in terms of the organizations that you're working with, everybody, the term cloud first is one that gets bandied around a little bit and has probably come first in terms of the priority list. But kind of how many organizations do you find actually there is still a split? They have a mix of on-premise, they have hybrid, and they have cloud as well.
Quite a large number of it. I would say the largest number is made of organizations that have a hybrid model. They have legacy systems, they have on-prem systems that have been running. So these are the bigger organizations that have been there for a long time.
Yeah.
They definitely have a hybrid model. With the newer organizations, particularly the startups, because we're surrounded by so many startups nowadays, they're fully cloud. Running fully cloud, nothing on-prem. And we do see more and more people moving from on-prem to the cloud because it's easier, it's more cost-effective. But with the large organizations, it's just simply a headache to move
Yeah.
to cloud and to fully move from on-prem because of so many legacy systems. And I'm sure Trend have seen the same.
We do every single day, every single call, every single customer, every single demo, every single time. But like to define, get out fly, to define, true hybrid requirement, we're seeing customers that want to use AWS, they want to use Azure, they want to use GCP, they want to use VMware and AWS, they want to use OpenStack, they want to consume. That's the first sort of hybrid requirement, that you can provide solutions that just within 2 to 3 minutes, bang, connected, visibility, and then begin the deployment procedures in any one of those cloud tiers. But the second subset of sort of defining what the hybrid requirement is, that they're not, so some admins, when you say Windows, they'll give you the vampire response, like, they just, but you have to be able to have a tool set that adheres to all the requirements: Red Hat, SUSE, Linux, Windows, Amazon Linux, all the thousands of flavors of those that exist. And as to agree with what Luca said, that hybrid requirement is massive. And no one customer then you would find sits and says, well, no, we only have VMware on-prem and that's all we do. You do find customers that are, but you'll have some that look at cheap workloads and options, and spinning things outside here would be cheaper. We can get rid of all of our costs and our on-prem, service costs and running and, energy and cooling and all of those things that cost a huge amount of money. So again, it makes good sense to say that, they want that hybrid model, but a lot of them are in a transitioning. They're either at the start, they're either in the middle using everything, or they're pure play, either one or the other.
And there is, of course, there's not just, when people talk about cloud, there isn't only one cloud as well. I think a report from IBM that showed that 85% of organizations that are embracing the cloud have multiple clouds. So as you mentioned, they may be in AWS, they may be in private data centers, they may have a bit of Google, or marketing departments span up some automation in Azure because that linked to something else that they were doing. So it's not just that hybrid, I suppose, it's that multi-cloud environment that organizations have to deal with as well.
Correct.
Yeah.
So kind of on that subject of the cloud, that when they move there, and absolutely it always sounds very exciting. You can get rid of all those costs. It's pay per consumption. There's a lot of attractiveness. One of the phrases that has kind of come in that organizations are increasingly hearing is shared responsibility. Previously, when you had your own on-premise network, that was down to you. Moving to the cloud, it all sounds very good. There's always security options there, but now there's this concept of shared responsibility. So what does that mean for organizations, and how do they need to adapt their cybersecurity to take that into account?
Well, Neil, as you said, like that shared responsibility model, I mean, there's a plethora of industry standards. I mean, how many of them are there now? But that shared responsibility model is a principle that sort of says, okay, I am a company, I used a little bit of, let's say, Azure, I'll use a little bit of OneDrive, Google, Dropbox, Share, all of these kind of, consumable SaaS services. And for me, it's the agility to move in between, the ability to sort of, denote or detect triggers or samples coming from, and that's what Trend is actually doing. They're building this holistic ecosystem. Today, we'll really only talk to you about one or two products, but so that you know that within that requirement, that type of industry, I think you might have some question coming up maybe about DevOps.
Yeah.
But again, having that holistic cloud-first approach, and to have, consumable, pick and choose, drop in the security, have full reporting, and, XDR, which is kind of something we'll be heading towards, and a lot of other vendors will be heading towards, but, hopefully I get a chance to talk about that too.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, if you found when you're working with organizations that are making that move, I mean, we all know that when you install, when you get a new laptop and you install Windows, that you may pick all the default options, but that's not necessarily, the best options for you. As those organizations kind of deploy out to the cloud, how easy is it you found that they do go for default, but actually, the complexity of those cloud environments are just the same as you would do on premise, and actually it always needs to be tailored, and organizations don't always necessarily take into account, the need to go very granular in terms of, looking at all the various different options and how they map that, because they are so different in the approach in terms of how you'd normally do it on premise.
I guess it depends on the size of the organization as well, because the larger organizations have pretty strict rules and policies in place when it comes to asset management, for example, when they deploy new assets in their environments. This with the smaller organization, this is a bit of a challenge, I would say, because they have this false sense of security that if they're moving to Azure, Microsoft, all these environments, they're secure because the cloud provider has done everything, and everything is secure. I don't have to worry about everything.
Yeah.
But the problem is, and like you said before, cloud security works on a shared responsibility model in most of the cases, right? Because the provider is supposed to secure the infrastructure that they provide, whereas you as the user, you're responsible for securing anything you install, run, or store in the cloud. So it goes back to the size of the organization and the policies that you have in place, whether you have a SOC in place or not, whether the SOC is in-house, outsourced, and the security tools that the organization have at a admin level. So if you're using, for example, Trend Micro products, in most cases there's an administrator who sets the rules, and you just plug in the computer and that's it. So that's the best case scenario, and you don't have to be a big organization to do that. That goes for all sizes. But the problem is that not everybody understands that model.
Yeah, it's a big misconception with the, that model that people think, if I have infrastructure of a service, I pay AWS, I pay Azure, I pay GCP, Google Cloud Platform. So, hey, aren't they my data processors? Aren't they the ones that are now responsible for? No, that's the big misconception. Exactly. Wherever you put your data, so if it's PII data, company data, project data, whatever it is, it's your data, and you're still responsible for it, under those. So again, it's to be very careful with that, not to to always check and look at the data sheets, if you will, to say, you'll always find the statements for each and every one of those cloud provisions saying, we're not responsible. This is our disclaimer. You still need to implement security and put security controls around the data, whether it's moving, resting, or being processed or whatever, so that you're still responsible for that.
Absolutely. Just let everybody know there is a handout as well that you can see, which is specifically around cloud workload protection from Trend Micro. So feel free to download it. There's also another poll question about whether organizations out there, how heavily you are relying on cloud applications for your processes. So just when we're talking about something kind of mentioned DevOps and having responsibility, obviously kind of moving workload to the cloud, having DevOps teams, the ability for organizations to be able to build their own applications very, very quickly now has transformed a number of organizations. But often DevOps we find they tend to sit a little bit differently. They're not part of the normal IT team. The way they work tends to be a little bit different from a cultural perspective as well, which is absolutely great. But obviously, that means they tend to work a little bit differently when it comes to cybersecurity best practice as well. So, kind of David, how can organizations make sure that they're all inside the tent when it comes to cybersecurity?
Yeah, I mean, when I meet the DevOps guys, I kind of think Neo Matrix propensity to follow the white rabbit, but talking to them over the last 4 years, Trend have been representing sponsorship at things like Kubernetes, DockerCon, all of these types of AWS global events. But from talking to them, again, what they want it's very simple. They want security as code, right? We've kind of touched on the whole infrastructure part of using AWS and all that, but they want infrastructure as code. So they want GUIs. They don't want to be plugging in, going deploy my EQ2 instance and get that running. They just want to click and off it goes. So they also then want security layers, and my God, do they want a lot of them. There's kind of storage requirements for S3 bucket containers. They want pipeline, basically security code that can be baked into their own applications that become serverless, that have no server, that float in containers, and they want to have live. Oh man! So it's wide and varied what these guys are looking for. But Trend Micro have built a very powerful tool set for those DevOps focused people. But then to your other question, Neil, the sort of problem with organizations, it's not so much now, but it used to be in the past, where you would have the DevOps guy, the Matrix, the Neo fellows, and you'd have the CISO and the CSO, and they just won't speak the same language. And then there's a finance person in the middle going, it's too expensive, and no, we're not doing it. And
Yeah.
nobody, you know what I mean? So the DevOps platform we're bringing together very much ties these people together, gives a nice app to the CISO, and so that he can see whether or not they're conforming on AWS and Azure, and have they configured, and have they left loose configurations and RBAC. And it is massive, the amount of things that we're bringing to this industry. But again, it is vigorously at a ferocious speed taking off in terms of that requirement, people looking for security as code. Now, Deep Security and Apex One, the primary tools that you guys would be familiar with, they already have a lot of API capability documented. DevOps can just go copy, paste, boom, create machine, push policy. They can do all of that already with us.
But actually, isn't this an opportunity, if we kind of take that as an example, to change cybersecurity a little bit in terms of, again, when we talk about it from a cultural perspective? Because if those teams are kind of baking in security as they're building the app, then security becomes part of a design rather than, oh yeah, guys, we should probably stick a WAF in front of that because there might be some holes in the code. It stops being an afterthought, and actually can, part of those conversations mean that security is part of the design, part of the infrastructure from the very off, rather than just an afterthought.
Which is how it should be, right? Security by design is a concept that definitely needs a little bit more love than it gets. A big problem that we've seen with DevOps teams is that they need access to everything. It doesn't matter to what. They need access to everything, all of the codes, all of the containers, everything, right? So if you are subject to a phishing attempt for credential theft, right, that becomes really tricky, because the more people have access to everything, the more the attack surface. But I agree with you guys in saying that we're definitely seeing a little bit more of a combination between security ops and DevOps, and it's becoming a bit more of a DevSecOps, which is great. But in my opinion, it's still quite slow. It should be better.
And as we're on the kind of subject around kind of building applications in cloud, we have had a question come in, because there's a new term that's kind of rising in popularity, and obviously that because of the threats out there, the phrase kind of man in the cloud attacks, and we've come across kind of man in the middle, kind of traditionally, kind of man in the cloud attacks. What do they look like, and why are they different to the sort of threats that we've had in the past?
Do I take that one?
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I suppose there's so many definitions of man in the cloud, but the real definition of man in the cloud is where a threat actor is going to position themselves somehow between your employee or the target and them. What they're key interested in getting is your token for Dropbox, Google Drive, SharePoint, OneDrive, your login for AWS, your company Salesforce account, whatever, or even your domain account. So that they would be the key areas that they would go after. You just hit me with that question again. I'm after drawing a blank.
Oh, so I mean, kind of how organizations need to kind of approach that differently to how they would kind of traditional attacks.
In terms of which exploit vector? Sorry.
Well, in terms of just kind of cloud applications, kind of traditionally, if they'd kind of been on premise, but kind of now they own that in a way that they didn't before. All the build is in house, but actually now it's sitting in the cloud.
Well, again, it's the pipelining operation that DevOps look for when they want that type of performance. Now, Trend does in fact have for a number of years different various products for it, like container security, SmartCheck as they call it, AppSec, which is copy paste libraries into your own code, do security of your code from within your code. It's really crazy stuff. But again, the complexity of what these guys are looking for, the best practice, of course, is to make sure that you've got the most security controls that are, again, least disruptive to your business. And again, that's what we've been building. We're still adding a lot of different technologies to that platform, if you will, or ecosystem of offerings. And
if I can maybe add to the man in the cloud attacks, the problem with the man in the cloud attacks is that it's extremely difficult to detect, because there is absolutely no malicious code no exploit used in the initial infection stage, as they call it. So
Yeah.
it makes it really, really impossible to detect with, let's say, traditional endpoint security tools. So the way to maybe think about it is and approach it is what type of intelligence tools do we need to detect something like that? Because the reality is that they're becoming really popular nowadays. They're easy to launch, difficult to detect. And what do they go after? They go after the users that use Dropbox, Google Drive, OneDrive, which is basically everyone, right? Everyone uses these file sharing systems. So a good security intelligence platform that monitors the cloud usage and the behavior to look for, let's say, irregular behavior is the best way to detect attacks like these. Because let's say the attacker is in Russia and you are in the UK. If he's going to steal that synchronization token to install on his machine, a good security intelligence tool is going to detect that the location is different. It's not the UK location that we're normally seeing the synchronization coming from. So it's actually Russia or it's China or God knows what. So we're going to stop this. So this is only done by, a proper SOC, which is difficult to do by traditional endpoints. But the best way to do it is by having the proper intelligence tools.
Yeah, that'd be geofencing and geolocating and
Exactly.
changing behavioral traits based on location. Yeah, that's very important.
Exactly. And the other thing that people need, organizations need, is proper DLP solutions, right? Because with DLP, you can put the rules in place. Something like, okay, if you notice that there's a rogue location trying to access a synchronization token and trying to copy data, basically, or synchronize data in a different location, just stop it, block it. And that's how it's done.
Yeah, we offer that across the board with everything that we make pretty much. As I said, ecosystem for the DevOps, ecosystem for the infrastructure guys. I've still got a fly in here, but having that ability to again streamline into those environments and make it simple and fast and efficient, and that's the tool set that we built would be able to kind of see. Especially with DLP, we'd be able to see movements of specific file types, data set types based on region. You can type Ireland and get all of the PII Irish kind of stuff. UK, you get all the UK specific regional identifiers. So that, if you do get something that moves through the layers and is still undetected, like Raluca said, it tries to lift data, copy it to FTP email, drop it to a network drive, drop it to you, where we can detect that, stop that, block that, notify you, and tell you who, where, why, what, when.
So there always comes that point in the presentation where you want to kind of really introduce that kind of really exciting topic to drive towards the end that's going to energize everyone. I'm going to talk compliance and GDPR. Yep, sorry guys. but when we're talking about the data, obviously that does lead us on to compliance and various different regulations that everybody has to conform to. How does that kind of change with cloud? What do organizations need to do a little bit differently? Kind of, Raluca, what's your kind of experience on that?
Sure. That's a great topic because I think when we say compliance, we all think GDPR. Everyone knows GDPR nowadays, right? And I would say that GDPR has definitely had an impact on cloud security. I would say a very positive impact. Because it has allowed, data controllers, which is quite a common term for GDPR, to be a little bit more systematic about ensuring privacy and security measures are in place and in line with the requirements. So one of the key specific challenges of GDPR is definitely its impact on cloud architecture and privacy by design. And what I mean by that is that when you're a data controller and you're engaging a cloud provider, you need to understand the underlying technology that the cloud provider are using because he's ultimately your data processor. And you've mentioned this before, David. You're putting your data and your systems in the cloud, in its cloud, in the cloud provider's systems. So you're responsible for making sure that you've done your vendor checks on the cloud provider and that the processing is done in accordance with your requirements. And another challenge that we commonly see when it comes to GDPR and compliance is the location. When GDPR came in 2018, there was a huge discussion around where does the data actually reside. So when you looked at Amazon, IBM Cloud, Microsoft, they all had data centers in Europe, right? Dublin, a lot of them in Dublin, Frankfurt. These are the two most popular locations for data centers. However, when you looked at Dropbox, data mostly reside in the US. So many companies started, looking at Dropbox. Okay, well, where is actually our data? Well, your data is in the US. Well, okay, well, that's not compliant. So can we do something about that? So they were forced to bring a lot more data into Frankfurt. They now have data centers into Frankfurt. So you had to go looking at that information. You had to ask them instead of them coming to you and saying, we know you're operating in the EU. You're most likely you most likely need to abide by EU laws. We like to tell you that your data is in the US. They didn't really do that. So you had to go looking for this information, which means checking vendor requirements is really, really important. And what I would say is that organizations shouldn't be afraid to go and ask the big guys, Microsoft, Amazon, Dropbox, hey, what's happening with my data? Where is it? Or, what type of measures are you implementing for securing infrastructure? They're used to getting these questions. And I would say, do the vendor checking requirements. Don't be afraid that it's a big cloud provider, small cloud provider. That's not the important part. The important part is that you are aware of what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And David, I suppose kind of, tradition when we've talked about data security as well, kind of DLP's always been kind of big, scary, it's enterprise projects. And I think it's all, it's always been a kind of challenging technology. But I think data security kind of nowadays is a lot easier. I think the technology has become a lot more simpler, and it's been a lot more manageable for kind of small and medium-sized organizations to be able to start getting better control, and visibility of where the data is in their organization, and therefore keeping better controls over, where it flows in and out in a more intelligent and proactive way. So if we just kind of move on from a kind of a compliance perspective in terms of kind of beginning to kind of look to wrap things up. In terms of, obviously, we've talked about kind of a huge amount of change that's kind of gone on over the last few years. If we can kind of get our crystal balls out in terms of what we think it might happen over the next 3 years, and kind of good luck to you both with this one, because if anyone can predict what's going to happen in the last 3 years, this is where I'm pleased you two are definitely doing the talking.
I'll be honest, definitely where we're headed in terms of an industry over the next couple of years, where I would see things going is more automation, more correlation, more line of sight, more simplicity, more non-disruption, less noise. And that is coming from a lot of the new XDR generation vendors, okay? Now, there's not a lot of them in that field at the moment. Some of them are starting out. We're 3 years, 4 years in, because we've started with a basic EDR functionality. Then we move to this, as I'm saying, ecosystem, visibility, track, take action immediately in record time, from email to endpoint to web gateway to USB device, whatever the case may be. That's I'd see that the threat actors, they're getting even more ferocious. I mean, I can do it in 5 minutes, hide a payload, get it through worry-free, go through all the layers and all of that. And only when you have this interconnected threat experience, in other words, it can get through these other layers, but we'll take this into a sandbox, detonate it in there, and within seconds, the whole business is told, hey, don't click this, block it, absolutely, the URL it came from, the IP address, the username, make it, that's where I see a lot of security. We'll say the people who live, the companies or vendors that live in those sort of leaders' magic quadrants, if you will. XDR is the direction, as I said, all of that automation and goodness.
Yeah.
Well, if I was to look at it from a cloud security perspective, I think that cloud providers like Azure, Google, AWS will all start to have their own native security features more and more. They've already started, of course, but they're offering security as a service with all of these things. However, these offerings will continue to be limited in what they're able to protect, and they might not well be integrated. So organizations really need to understand what does that mean for them. And if we were to look at some trends that we see happening, I think the insider attacks will continue to grow. It's already a huge risk for companies, and that will continue to grow, especially as we're creating more and more data, valuable data, that some people are looking to steal. Well, sometimes intentionally, sometimes accidentally, who knows? I think machine learning for cloud security will evolve in automation. So exactly what was just mentioned 2 minutes ago. And I definitely see and hope for more integration between DevOps and SecOps.
Yeah, smashing. That's great. And then just to finish off, in terms of, if there was kind of one kind of key tip or kind of, example of kind of practical steps or best practice that anybody watching can kind of think, right, okay, so for tomorrow, what's the one takeaway I'd have that I can look to improve our cybersecurity posture or strategy moving forward? Kind of what would you suggest?
Well, I'll take this one first. I would say, if you're not sure about your own security, just do a gap analysis. Really look at doing an independent gap analysis with experts and really get an accurate picture of where you are, because you're focused on your business. You may not know everything about security. You may not know all of the areas where it's evolving. So you could potentially be missing out on a few risks that you were not aware of. So running an annual gap analysis is a really good way of understanding your posture. And the nice thing about that is that you can take the gaps, you put them on your risk register, and you have an action plan. So I would say one of the tips there from my side anyway is run a health check on your systems.
And for me, I may be as blunt as just to say, book a demo with Trend and have a look at XDR and see that thing in action. We'll detonate 0-day payload. We'll run it to the system, ping it out through email, and have the whole thing correlate, draw it back, block it automatically. You can type in queries of usernames, IP addresses, host names, reg keys, URLs, and have the system just go and draw out the complete picture of what you're doing. So again, the way I'd answer that, if you're going to do something tomorrow, think to yourself, I want to talk to Dave and I want to see that XDR in action.
Absolutely.
Well, first they have to talk to me.
Yeah.
First to Raluca, of course. Yes.
Absolutely.
Sorry.
and that'll give people a lot of visibility in terms of nothing else, what's going on in their system. So they'll get, get a really good starting point in terms of, right, what do my priorities need to be?
Visibility is always key.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Again, this is an industry first for us because we can do that. We can, from that endpoint detection, we can show that lateral map, all the beautiful little pictures and the name and the file and what they did and all that. But we can then click on the Outlook client and a little box pops out and says there are 10 more recipients with this email. You can click clean, quarantine, lockdown, whatever. So again, we've already begun that heavy automation sort of capability into identifying, the threat, dealing with the threat, cleaning the threat, inoculating it. That's already there. But we've some ways to go. We still got a lot more to put in there. But as it is today, we're one of the most powerful when it comes to that type of technology.
Oh, and hopefully getting the technology to do even more work so people can concentrate on, kind of more strategic developments rather than having to do all that themselves.
Neil, absolutely. How many of the customers there are going to spend all this money, skilling up engineers to use Wireshark to do correlation of threat from PBX switch, endpoint, exchange server, and to sit there for a day or two, maybe be charging anything up to $2,000 a day to draw that picture? What we're saying is this system does it. You don't need to have the high price. And again, that's another issue that it addresses is the cost of, the IT skills gap or the shortage, if you will. Yeah. Again, having automation take care of all of this. That's
And I think that skills gap again is something else that's probably risen, and and kind of like definitely from a takeaway from my side that we've seen that there are gaps. Organizations can't do absolutely everything. So the key is to identify, as you say, do the risk analysis, see where the gaps are, and prioritize. And again, I think it's fair enough. you can't have every security product in every single solution, but if you can have something that integrates, that does a lot of that automated work for you, then you can focus on what's important, and cover all the basics, because the basics are still easy to miss. There's still lots of people aren't doing that. So,
Yeah.
All right, well, I think we've reached to the end. Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much, Raluca. Thank you,
Neil,
everybody, for attending.
Thanks, audience.
Any questions afterwards? Obviously, speak to Smart Tech. They'll be happy to kind of set up a demo with Trend, or provide any more information. And thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Bye bye.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.